Good evening, this is Mr. Wintermelon. So you have watched the worst video on diffusion and osmosis. Why not make it a hat trick and watch the worst video on active transport? Unlike diffusion and osmosis, which is a passive process, active transport is an active process. And we have to go back to the concept of concentration gradient to understand this process. So below is the definition. Please copy this down inside your notebook. Active transport is the process where energy is required to move molecules across a partially permeable membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration, like what the Spider-Man is doing. So energy is required to move from lower to higher concentration. So active transport will work against a concentration gradient. Since active transport requires energy, they can only occur in living cell, which produces ATP, unlike diffusion and osmosis that can occur in a dead cell. So to help you further understand active transport, I have this simulation. What is happening here is we have a layer of cell membrane. You can see the phospholipids bilayer, as well as the transport channel protein that is right smack in the middle. Now, the understanding of active transport and the description of how it works is not required for your O-level syllabus. You just need to know the definition that you have just copied down and apply it to the question. But kudos to the person who teach you about phospholipids bilayer as well as transport channel, so that you can fully appreciate active transport. What is going to happen is these purple molecules will bind to the binding site and it will be transported over to the other side. But the problem here is, can you see that the binding site, the shape of the binding site is 3, while this molecules is circular in shape. So the problem is this particle actually will not fit into the binding site. So what is the solution for this? The solution is to use energy to change the shape of the binding site. So let us take a look. What is going to happen is ATP, the energy molecules, will come over and donate one phosphate to the channel protein. Now you can see that the channel protein, the shape has changed after the donation of the phosphate. So right now it is semicircle and the purple molecules can fit into the binding site. So what is going to happen is the molecules is going to bind to the binding site. Then the channel protein will change its shape. After the channel protein releases the molecules, the binding site will change back into its original shape. Then the phosphate will also unbind with the channel protein and get released. So other molecules will not be able to bind to the binding site. So if we want to transport another molecules over, we have to repeat the process. ATP have to donate a phosphate to change the shape of the binding site. Then the molecules can bind. After the molecules bind, the channel protein will change the shape and phosphate will be released, as well as the protein to be transported over. So this is how active transport uses energy to transport molecules against a concentration gradient. So we are done with active transport, but cannot. It will be a video that is less than 10 minutes. I have to make it longer than 10 minutes. So let us look at the significance of these three mechanisms to life, or example of these three mechanisms taking place in living organism. First off, let's look at inside human, specifically our lung. So inside our lung, our red blood cell have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. What will happen is those carbon dioxide will diffuse out into the air space inside our lung, while the air space in our lung have a higher concentration of oxygen because we just breathe in the fresh air, and the higher concentration of oxygen will diffuse down a concentration gradient into the red blood cell. So this is the example of diffusion which occurs inside our lung. Next, let's look at plant, specifically the root. So inside the root, two processes actually occurs. We will first talk about active transport. In the root, the concentration of mineral ions, or the important mineral ions, is actually higher than the concentration of mineral ion in the soil. So what is going to happen is the root will use active transport to move the mineral ion into the root hair cell. So after moving the ion into the root hair cell, the water potential of the root hair cell will actually decrease. So the water potential in the root hair cell is lower than the water potential in the soil, because maybe you just water, or maybe it just rain. So the water potential in the soil is very high. Therefore, the water molecules will move into the cell through osmosis. So these are the example of diffusion, active transport, as well as osmosis taking place in a living system. And we will finish off this chapter by discussing factors that will affect rate of diffusion as well as osmosis. Shit, it's still shorter than 10 minutes.